Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the July 3rd Thursday Web Forum. I can tell that we've already had a little bit of background noise and an echo this morning, so I'm going to go ahead and put us in silent mode off the bat here.
The conference is now in silent mode.
So as always, my name's Hillary Morris. I work on user support and communications for the South Atlantic and Southeast Conservation Blueprints. In this third Thursday Web Forum we hold every month here at 10 a.m. To give folks like you a chance to ask questions and provide input to help guide our conservation future here in the South Atlantic region. So here's our usual agenda. I'll start by introducing our speaker, who will give us a 30 to 40 minute presentation on the monthly topic. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion after that. Then I'll wrap up by previewing our next webinar and giving a few staff updates, and we'll be able to pause again for discussion at the end of that. So before I move on to introducing our speaker, does anybody have any questions? I know I already put us in silent mode, but if you have questions or comments, you can pop them in the chat box real quick. All right, great. So that'll be the same process during the presentation. If you have questions, just go ahead and enter them into the chat box, and then I'll unmute everybody for the Q&A at the end. All right, so without further ado, today we're going to be hearing from Katie Warnell, who's a policy associate in the Ecosystem Services program at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke. And she's going to be talking to us about the Nicholas Institute's work on ecosystem services mapping and tell us a bit about how these mapping products can be used to enhance conservation work here in the Southeast. So with that, Katie, I will pass you the presenter power, and you can take us away. Just remember *6 to unmute your line.
I'm really glad to be speaking to this group today. As Hillary mentioned, I work at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke. And today I'm going to tell you about an ongoing project here to map ecosystem services across the southeastern U.S. to provide information for planning and decision-making, and how that information can also be used to enhance conservation planning and communication specifically. So before I get into the details of the project, I just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page about ecosystem services, because I know that it's not something that everyone thinks about. So an ecosystem service is any benefit that people get from nature. This can include tangible products, things like timber and fish. It can be things like essential processes, things like air and water purification, and even people's engagement with natural areas through recreational activities. And we think that the concept of ecosystem services is useful for planning and decision-making for two reasons. Because it directly connects people to nature, it can be a useful communication tool to help illustrate why a particular project is relevant to stakeholders. And considering ecosystem services implications of a project can help to identify trade-offs in terms of both the services affected or the people who benefit from those services. And it's important to ensure that ecosystem services are explicitly considered during planning processes, especially that could have any adverse effects on them, as they're often taken for granted until they are adversely affected. So I want to tell you just a little bit about a previous project that some of my colleagues here did with a different LCC, the Gulf Coastal Plain and Ozarks LCC, back in 2016. This project had two main parts. There is a survey that identified landowners' priorities among the ecosystem services that their land either provides or could provide. And then the spatial analysis mapped the distribution of a variety of ecosystem services. These two components were combined to help with conservation planning and communication with landowners. So, for example, this map shows how the distribution of carbon sequestration aligns with several other ecosystem services. Carbon sequestration was among the most important ecosystem services to the landowners in many of the counties in the study area, and those are the counties shown in color on this map. And then maps of the other ecosystem services were overlaid on those counties to identify what co-benefits could be gained by conserving land or restoring land for carbon sequestration, and those are shown in blue for conservation and in green for restoration. And the lighter color areas in each of those colors are places that are only expected to provide carbon benefits, while the darker areas would also provide co-benefits, things like conservation for vertebrate biodiversity, water infiltration capacity, and pollinator habitat. So the GCPO LCC saw this as a useful tool for identifying those co-benefits of existing and planned conservation projects, for communicating about those projects to a broader audience, and for aligning their work with community and funder interests. So the current project that I'll be focusing on today is in some ways kind of a scaled up version of that. So our goal is to identify priority areas for each ecosystem service across the Southeast, and these are areas where land conservation or restoration would be most beneficial to that service. We think that mapping the ecosystem services is an especially helpful way to consider them because so many of them are kind of inherently spatial. Services are often only available immediately surrounding the area where they're produced, and so mapping is a good way to understand what areas are benefiting the most or the least from a particular service, and where there might be priorities for doing work to help support these services. So our project was an effort to map ecosystem services over this fairly large area, 10 states in the southeastern U.S., to provide this information that, again, is useful for conservation planning. You can also use it for tracking trends over time and for looking at it alongside other types of data like human populations or climate data. And as I'll show you in more detail at the end of the talk today, we're in the process of making these data publicly available, and we hope that they'll be of use to this community. So for each service that we considered, we aim to identify these priority areas. And because we are doing this mapping over such a broad spatial area and trying to make it as useful as we could, we had a few considerations as we were developing the analyses. So we only use publicly available data and non-proprietary methods. The methods are not overly intensive either in terms of the data requirements or computationally. This is because we want them to be able to be rerun as new data comes out without a huge time or money investment. And also because we are running them over a large spatial extent and need to be able to run them in a reasonable amount of time. And we aim to capture information on either the actual use of the service or on supply of and demand for that service. In a lot of cases, we were constrained by the data that's available related to these services and our understanding of how each service is provided. In some cases, we did have data on the actual use of the service, but in many other cases, we did not. But in all cases, we tried to design the analyses to take into account both the natural and the human sides of the equation. So not just looking at what the ecosystem looks like, but also where there are demand for these services, where there are people or other components of the human system that actually benefit from the services. So our goal overall is to get a big picture idea of the spatial distribution of each service for planning and for potential on-the-ground follow-up if more specific information is needed to plan a particular project. So this table shows the mapping analyses that we're working on. As you can see, several of them are already complete or will be complete in the very near future. And today I'm gonna focus on these first four that are kind of the closest to being done, and these are the ones that we anticipate will be publicly available in the very near future, as I'll discuss more at the end. So for the rest of our time, I'm gonna give a quick overview of each of these four individual analyses, and then some examples of how the information in maps can be used to enhance conservation planning and communication. So first up is wild pollination potential. We don't have data on actual pollination or pollinator activity. We found that we also don't have sufficient data or knowledge to be able to model either of those metrics across such a broad spatial area. So instead, we use the supply and demand framework to identify areas where pollination is expected to occur and where there's high demand for pollination. So demand for pollination is represented by pollinator-dependent crops. These are crops that need to be pollinated in order to create the commercially valuable component, like the fruit. And supply of pollination comes from areas of potential pollinator habitat. And we use this supply and demand framework to generate three metrics that went into our identification of priority areas for pollinator habitat conservation and restoration. The first is a demand metric, which is just the amount of pollinator-dependent cropland. And then we have two supply metrics. The first one, shown in the middle map, is relative pollinator activity on that cropland based on distance from pollinator habitat. So in the middle map, the pollinator habitat is shown in purple, and then the pollinator-dependent cropland, which is orange on the leftmost map, is shown in shades of yellow and blue. And the darker blue on the cropland are places where we expect relative pollinator activity to be higher because it's closer to pollinator habitat than the areas that are lighter blue or yellow. And then our final supply metric was the amount of pollinator habitat near pollinator-dependent cropland. So again, in the third map frame here, pollinator habitat is in purple, and then the pollinator-dependent crops are shown in shades of green according to how much of the surrounding land is actually pollinator habitat. So you can see that some areas are very dark green because they have a lot of pollinator habitat surrounding them, where the lighter green and white areas have much less surrounding land that is pollinator habitat. These two supply metrics were things that we developed in the literature that were linked to the actual supply of pollination and things like seed set and fruit set in pollinator-dependent crops. So we summarized each of these metrics by county to identify priority areas. All of the priority areas have high demand for pollination. They all have at least 10% pollinator-dependent crops by area. The restoration priority areas are shown in purple. They score low in the two supply metrics. So they're areas where restoration of pollinator habitat is expected to benefit the kind of extent of the pollination service that's happening in those counties. And the conservation priority areas in dark green have a moderate supply of the supply metrics. And so these are areas where we want to protect pollinator habitat so that it isn't lost, which might push them into the kind of low supply category. You also notice that there are some light green counties here. Those are also counties with high demand for pollination, but they also score really high on the supply metrics, and so they're lower priority for conservation actions targeting pollinator habitat. They have a bit more of a buffer in terms of the amount of habitat and the distribution of habitat near those pollinator-dependent crops before we would expect the pollination service to be affected. All right, moving on to the second service we looked at, which is recreational birding. So this is a case where we actually were able to estimate the amount of recreational birding occurring in different areas. We did that based on a national survey of wildlife-associated recreation. That gave us kind of a total amount of birding activity measured in birding days by state. And then we also used eBird, which is a citizen science database where people who go birding are able to upload information on the birds that they saw and where they saw them. That gave us more fine-scale spatial information about where people are going birding. We identified high-use areas for birding based on the number of birding days that take place per square mile in each county. That's the map on the left. And then defined areas where land protection is needed to help ensure that these opportunities for birding continue to persist into the future. We calculated the proportion of birding days in each county that took place on unprotected land. You can see that there are quite a few counties that actually have more than 90% of their birding days taking place on unprotected land. And I guess one thing to note about this analysis is that we did not include people who are just birding around their house or in their own backyard. So these are all birding excursions where people are going, they might not be going far from home, but they are actually leaving their home and going to a particular place in order to go birding. So we used those two metrics to identify priority conservation areas for recreational birding. Those are shown in dark green. So these have high use for recreational birding, and most of that birding takes place on unprotected land. The light green counties also have high use, so lots of birding days, but they have less of that birding taking place on unprotected land, so they're just not as high priority for actually conserving those places to ensure that birding continues into the future. For this analysis, we did not identify restoration priority areas, so places where we think you could actually restore bird habitat in order to create better or new places to go birding, because that would require kind of much deeper knowledge about the relationship between bird habitat quality, bird populations, and recreational birding, which gets very complex very quickly. All right, the third analysis is water purification of non-point source pollutants from agricultural land. So non-point source pollutants, of course, could come from other types of land, especially urban land, but we didn't include urban land in this analysis because the artificial drainage and kind of stormwater management that often occurs in urban areas makes it a lot harder to figure out where the water is actually going from those urban areas into streams. This analysis is focused on how natural land cover can remove non-point source pollutants coming off of agricultural lands before they hit waterways. So to do this, we used an analysis based on land cover and elevation. So first, we started by identifying where there are those agricultural areas that can contribute non-point source pollution. And then from the digital elevation model, we identified flow paths from those areas of non-point source pollutants to streams and other waterways. So in the map on the right, you can see the stream in the middle in blue. The yellow is the agricultural land that's potential contribution of non-point source pollutants. And then the orange are the flow paths from those non-point source pollutant agricultural areas to the waterways. And then what we did was we overlaid potentially purifying land cover, so things like forests, wetlands, and natural grasslands that are able to slow the flow of water and physically remove pollutants from the water before it reaches streams. So we looked at where those purifying land cover types occur in the flow paths between agricultural non-point source pollutant sources and waterways. This is just a really simple way to identify where natural land cover might actually be helping to reduce the pollutant loads of water entering streams. So from this analysis, we created two metrics for each county. Demand for water purification was determined by the amount of agricultural land, and the supply of water purification was based on the proportion of the land in the flow path between agricultural land and waterways that's covered by purifying land cover types. So that's a bit of a mouthful. So to go back to this map quickly, what we did for each county was we totaled up the area of all of the green flow paths. Those are the flow path area that are purifying land cover types. And we divided that by the total amount of orange, which are the total area of the flow path. So that just gives us an indication of basically how much of the flow paths that are potentially bringing agricultural contaminants into waterways is buffered by natural land cover. So here are the priority areas for water purification. Again, all of these priority areas have high demand. They're in the top 25% of all counties in terms of their agricultural land coverage. The restoration priorities are in dark purple. They also have really low supply. Less than 10% of that flow path area is covered by purifying land cover. And the light purple, the conservation priorities have relatively high supply. So in this case, it was at least 23%. That again corresponds to the top quartile among all the counties of that flow path area is covered by purifying land cover. For this analysis, we identified these light purple areas as well. So these are other areas that are highly agricultural, and they score in between the restoration and the conservation areas on the purifying land cover metric. So we would consider these to be secondary priorities for both restoration and conservation of purifying land cover. They're definitely areas that would benefit from removal of pollutants based on the amount of agricultural land, but their kind of current supply of water purification isn't so low that they're high priority for restoration, or so high that we think they're good targets for conservation to make sure that service continues. But doing either restoration or conservation aimed at water purification in any of those light purple counties would definitely be worthwhile as well. All right, moving on to our last analysis is open space recreation. This one's a little different because it's so directly related to people, but the supply of this service is represented by publicly accessible open space. This can include local municipal parks, state and national parks or forests, recreation areas, private nature preserves, really anywhere that's an open space that is accessible to people for use for recreation. And then the demand for this is given by the human population, who's up to use parks. And we know that people most frequently visit open spaces that are near their homes, especially if they are able to walk to those open spaces. So we started by assessing access to open spaces based on the distance to the nearest open space area. So here, again, those open spaces are in pink, and the unshaded areas directly adjacent to the open spaces are half-mile buffers. So all the land that's not shaded is within a half-mile of an open space, publicly accessible open space. Blue areas are outside half-mile but within 3 miles of open space. The orange areas are outside 3 miles but within 10 miles of open space. And there aren't any on this map. There are a few in the study area, but not very many. We did have another category, which would be shown in light red, that are areas not within 10 miles of open space. So that's kind of the lowest access to open space. You'd have to drive a considerable distance to get to open space from those areas. To figure out where new open space would be most beneficial to people in terms of increasing park access, we overlaid population, which I showed in the previous slide, on top of this park access index. And so this let us find where there are people who live in each of these distance categories, where they do have access to open space within a half mile. They would have to drive a short distance, up to 3 miles, to reach open space, or they would have to drive more than 3 miles, up to 10 miles, to access open space. So we actually extracted the human population in each of these different access categories and estimated the number of people who would gain increased access to open space if new open space were created in each pixel in the study area. So basically, we looked at each pixel and we looked at a half mile, 3 mile, and 10 mile perimeter and tallied up the number of people who currently don't have access to open space within that distance. And those are the people who would experience increased access to open space if there were new open space created on that pixel. So this was done for each distance category separately and summarized by county. And then we standardized each of those totals by the maximum across all of the counties. And the standardized scores for each distance category were then averaged within each county to create an overall benefit score for creating new open space within that county. And that was just a fairly simple way to get information about each of those different distance categories into one kind of final index to identify the priorities for open space. So here are the priority counties for open space recreation. These all score in the top 10% on that combined benefits score I just mentioned. So these are areas where creating new publicly accessible open space is expected to enhance park access for most people overall. In this analysis, we didn't differentiate between conservation and restoration priorities. Either activity could benefit open space access as long as the newly conserved or restored land is open to the public. And one more note on this one is that for open space in particular, it definitely depends, the benefit of creating new open space within any of these priority counties depends very strongly on where specifically that open space would be created. And so in this analysis, we weren't able to specifically look at that. For example, you could overlay something like vacant parcels or maybe vacant city-owned parcels as places that might be good candidates for new open space. We weren't able to do that on this scale, but we will provide, when we make this data accessible, the underlying data layers that will make it possible for users to do that if they're interested in doing that on a more local level, if they do have that information, which will give you a finer scale understanding of how a particular park, particular newly created open space might improve access to open spaces for people. All right, so that's my overview of the 4 ecosystem service analyses that we are nearly done with that will be available publicly very soon. So now I'd like to transition into how these ecosystem service maps can be used for conservation planning and communication. So one way is just by specifically targeting projects to enhance a particular service, perhaps the service that's of interest to a community or to a particular funder. So for example, this map shows the restoration priorities for pollinator habitat could be used to identify where restoration projects are most needed, of course, at the entire regional scale. So this is the county level prioritization that I showed you before. We also did a watershed level. This is a HUC 12 level prioritization, which highlights more specific priority areas. And as you can see, looking at it at this scale also identifies some priority areas that aren't included in the county level priorities. For example, if you look at Missouri, you can see that there's a few counties that are identified as priorities for restoration, but if you look at the watershed level, it's a lot more distributed throughout the state. So looking at this scale can be helpful for a bit finer scale or for exploring kind of a wider range of options for places that might benefit this service. We did a similar finer scale version of each of the other analyses. Many of them are linked to watersheds because it's often a good framework for conservation planning. For the open space analysis in particular, we used census block groups since that one is so directly tied to human populations. You can also look at multiple ecosystem service maps together to locate projects with specific co-benefits. So for example, where would a project benefit both open space recreation and recreational birding, so the 2 types of recreation that we considered? This map uses open space recreation as the primary filter. So the white counties, county shaded white here, are not priorities for open space, so they wouldn't be considered. And then the open space priority counties are then shaded based on their priority rating for recreational birding. The green counties are priorities for both types of recreation, and the gray are only priorities for open space and not for birding. And so this identifies a few counties throughout the Southeast where creating additional open space would be really helpful, not just for general open space recreation, but also specifically for providing protected areas for birding in places where there's lots of birding happening on unprotected land. So as I'm sure you've noticed, so far the examples that I've shown have been aimed at regional level planning, so when you're considering a project across a multi-state area. But lots of conservation does take place at more local scales, such as the state level or even finer. And so you've probably noticed that in the regional maps, there are certain states that have very few or even no priority counties for certain services. So this is true of South Carolina for water purification, because South Carolina has less agricultural land than some of those other states like Mississippi and Missouri. Its counties don't meet the demand criterion, so it just doesn't have enough agricultural land to come up as a priority. So to make our analyses more useful for this situation, the data sets that we're making available have attributes including the metrics that went into the identification of priority areas, as well as just flagging the regional priorities. So these metrics can be used to visualize the supply and demand of a service in a smaller area of interest, and also to adjust the criteria for priorities as necessary for that area of interest. So for example, we can look at the two metrics that go into water purification priorities, looking at them for South Carolina in particular. So on the left is agricultural land coverage, and so even though it's not as high as in some other states, there are some counties that have more than 30% agricultural land coverage, and quite a few with more than 20%. And then the second map on the right shows, again, that proportion of purifying land cover in the flow path. And so you can see that several counties there with really high agricultural land coverage and really low purifying land cover in the flow path would be the likely restoration priorities for water purification in South Carolina, even though they don't come up as priorities on the regional scale. And I don't have time to get into this in a lot of detail today, but we will also be providing the underlying data sets. So kind of going one step farther down, this includes a lot of raster data sets that we developed as well as some other tables and things. So for water purification, that would include that agricultural land coverage for non-point source pollution and the flow paths that we generated that are used to calculate those metrics, and that would allow you to make even more substantial adjustments to how priority areas are defined if you have specific ideas for an area of interest. We can also use the ecosystem service maps to identify the services that might be provided by existing conservation lands, which can help to guide the communication and management of those lands. So, for example, these are two counties in central Tennessee that are priorities for recreational birding. So there's lots of recreational birding activity in these areas, and more than 90% of that activity takes place on unprotected land. But as you can see in the bright green on this map, there are protected lands in both of these counties. And if land managers recognize that birding is a popular activity in these counties, they could potentially attract birders to the protected lands, either via communication and messaging around that, or via management to enhance either the access or quality of birding opportunities on the lands that are protected. And by attracting birding activity to the protected lands, this could ensure that birding opportunities overall in these counties aren't threatened by land development or other changes to unprotected land where birding is currently occurring. And then finally, we can use the ecosystem service maps in conjunction with other conservation planning tools, such as the conservation blueprint. So there's a cluster of counties in eastern North Carolina that are priorities for open space recreation and that have a considerable amount of land that's rated high and highest priority in conservation blueprint, as you can see in the dark purple and the bright pink overlays on this map. So preserving that high and highest priority land in those counties would also provide an opportunity to enhance open space recreation if the projects are designed to permit access, while of course also protecting those high quality conservation assets. In addition, you can potentially enhance community buy-in to protection or conservation projects aimed at those blueprint lands if the projects are also planned to provide community amenities like places, green space and open space that the community can use to recreate, particularly in these counties that have fairly low opportunities for that currently. All right, so I think that's all the examples we have time for today. So I want to quickly let you know about the publication status of these data. I'm currently in the process of getting them published on ScienceBase through USGS, which is our funder for this project through the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. So the pollination data is actually all up on ScienceBase and ready to go. I was hoping to have it publicly available to show you all today, but it's still waiting for some final touches on the ScienceBase side before it can be made public. So that should be available in the next week, I would say. And then the other data sets that I showed you today will be following soon after. So again, there will be a ScienceBase page like this one for pollinator habitat for each of the analyses, and then they'll each have several data sets attached, including both the regional priority data sets at the county level and an additional finer scale. They'll also have those additional attributes in those shapefile, county, and another scale data sets that will provide additional information on the metrics used to identify priorities, as well as separate data sets containing the underlying data used to calculate the metrics to enable even further customization of the data by the user. And then along with the data, we're also publishing a series of methods briefs, one for each data set, which have background on the service, on our approach to mapping it, as well as detailed methods for the analysis and a discussion of how the data can be used. All right, so that's it for me. Thanks again for the opportunity to share with this group. Definitely happy to take any questions from you in the time we have now, or feel free to follow up with me if anything comes up in the future, especially if you are using any of these data in the future. We would love to hear about any particular uses and any suggestions that you have for making the data or how we're presenting it more useful for conservation planning and communication in particular. Thanks.
Awesome presentation. Thank you, Katie. One thing I did want to highlight for those of you who've tuned in today is that the public access piece that Katie talked about today, we're hoping to use in an improved version of our urban open space indicator in the next version of the South Atlantic Blueprint. So we're already seeing great applications of some of these models to the blueprint in our work. So with that, I'll just go ahead and take us out of silent mode so that we can interact a little bit more freely. So please do be mindful of muting your own phone so that we don't get a lot of background noise.
The conference is now in talk mode.
So at this point, you can just manage your phone line with the mute button on your phone, or you can always submit questions via the chat box. Does anyone have questions for Katie? We probably have 10 or 15 minutes for it, so plenty of time to get a good discussion going. Here's a question in the chat box from Alec Nelson. How are the thresholds of what was considered to be a restoration or conservation priority determined?
That's a good question. So that really depended on the analysis. Where we had particular information from the literature that helped us to determine where there might be sufficient supply or insufficient supply, we used those kind of the literature information as guidance. So that, for example, applies to the pollination analysis, because there has been quite a bit of research done into kind of how natural lands can provide pollination services and kind of where there are thresholds for having sufficient or insufficient natural lands and wild pollinators to provide that service. For many of the other services, the same sort of information didn't exist kind of in the format that we needed or with the particular metrics that we were able to map across the region that we were mapping. So in those cases, the thresholds are normally determined by looking at the distribution of each of the metrics across each of the counties and the watersheds or whatever other level of aggregation we are using. And basically, we were trying to balance finding a broad enough set of priorities that covered, kind of across the whole spatial area and wasn't entirely confined to one region within the 10-state area, but also not identifying, hundreds of priority areas. But they certainly are, a bit arbitrary and based on the data rather than kind of any external understanding of the service for several of these. And that's one reason that we think it's important to provide all the information to let people adjust those as needed, especially if you do have that sort of information for a particular location, or if you're able to, for example, incorporate some field data on the ground data that you have for your study area or particular area of interest, that you might be able to determine better thresholds for that location.
Great, thanks. That makes sense. Sort of building on that question about the underlying data, Sarah Anderson asked in the chat box, you mostly summed data sets to county level units, and then you showed some watersheds as well. So at what scale are those underlying data sets? Like how fine of a scale could you summarize the data?
So many of the underlying data sets are tied to things like land cover that are available on, a 30 meter resolution. In general, we think of these as kind of landscape level data sets. So HUC-12 is pretty fine for identifying priority areas for that, particularly for things like the pollination, water purification analyses. We don't think that the data, just the quality of that underlying data is sufficient, and the accuracy is sufficient to be able to look at particular parcels, but they can help to guide, where we want to invest conservation action in particular parcels. I think open space recreation analysis is one where we're a bit more confident in that underlying data. Although of course the population data is, it's a asymmetric allocation of census data. And so there is some uncertainty there. But we do feel comfortable going a little bit finer scale on that one. And those census block groups that we use are finer scale than the HUC-12 that we use for many of the other analyses.
Great, thank you. Great, thanks, Katie. Another question from the chat box. I love it. I love all the participation. How do these ES data products relate to EPA EnviroAtlas and ecosystem services products?
That's a great question. Yeah, we've looked at EnviroAtlas a lot as we were developing these, and we found that there's a lot of really great information in EnviroAtlas. A lot of it kind of addresses maybe one component of a service. So, for example, they have some information, I think, on where there's pollinator habitat near crops, but it doesn't kind of take that next step of trying to understand how that translates into where we want to prioritize effort. And then for several of the other services, there are a few related layers in EnviroAtlas, but it just doesn't pull everything together like we're trying to do. So for birding, there are some, I think, bird species richness areas in EnviroAtlas. So that's a layer that's available, but it doesn't tie it. There's nothing in there about actual recreational birding activity or the level of that activity. And some of those EnviroAtlas layers might be useful to look at in addition to our ecosystem services maps. For example, there's a bunch of EnviroAtlas layers looking at water quality. So that would be a great one to overlay with the water purification analysis to kind of maybe further prioritize or figure out where in your study area water quality might be actually suffering due to non-point source pollution. So yeah, we think they're a great resource and definitely useful to look at with these ecosystem service maps, but we think that our mapping just does a little bit better job of kind of integrating multiple types of data to actually try to get at how the supply and demand for these ecosystem services interact spatially.
Great. I'll go ahead and pause for some more questions. The chat box is currently empty, but please feel free to speak up on the phone as well. All right, well, it sounds like folks have quieted down for now. What I'm going to do is take back the presenter power and wrap up with a preview of next month's webinar, as well as some updates from Blueprint staff. And then we can pause again for questions at the end if anything has occurred to you in the meantime. So next month's web forum is going to be on August 15th, same time, same connection information as today. And our speaker is going to be Dennis Halema, who's a hydrologist with the Southern Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service, and he'll be talking about some of his work on the impacts of prescribed fire and longleaf restoration on water supply in the Southeast. So essentially this work focuses on the Apalachicola-Chattahoochee Flint, or ACF Basin, which has a lot of pressure on its water resources due to urbanization and agricultural expansion in that area. So there's a lot of long-term water planning going on in that region. It's also a place that's affected by drought, typically every 1 to 4 years, and the worst drought impacts are usually occurring during the summer when demand for residential use and crop irrigation is also highest. So considering these sort of competing demands and availability for the water in this area, it seemed like a great place to start to explore how longleaf restoration efforts and the restoration of sort of the native plants of the longleaf community in the southeast coastal plain can actually increase the surface water that's available. So this work has been using the Soil and Water Assessment Tool, or SWAT, and it is suggesting that longleaf pine restoration can benefit water supply and increase availability of water, especially in the summer during that really high demand period. So we're kind of excited about the implications of this work to just kind of give us another way to support the importance of longleaf restoration, not just for the biodiversity benefits, but also for these water benefits as well. So if you're interested in longleaf or fire or water, definitely encourage you to tune in next month. We do have one quick staff update this month. Rua is going to talk to us a little bit about the blueprint improvements that are in the works for this year in the Southeast blueprint. So Rua?
Hey, everybody. So improvements in the works. So one of the big things we're focusing on is improving how we deal with some of these areas of overlapping inputs. There's some spots out in Texas and West Virginia and other spots that folks that are currently over prioritized, and usually it's something that people see immediately. And so we're working with some smaller local folks to figure out some better ways of dealing with those areas. So that should look fairly nice. We've got some updated inputs from the Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks, Peninsula Florida, a few other places. So some better data coming into there, and then also an expanded marine area that will then kind of basically wrap around Florida is what we're expecting for this version. So we'll have the Atlantic coast and then the full sort of Florida marine area going into the Gulf as part of the Southeast Blueprint. So that is exciting. Also expanding our hubs and corridors layer. So we had a version that the last one we released just integrated the South Atlantic and Appalachians regions, and we're expecting to have the integrate now with the rest of Florida and then west of the Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks, which will cover most of the Southeast with an integrated hubs and corridors layer. So that's exciting, and then got some really cool additional data to help you use the blueprint that we're working on as well. And so we'll see which of them are ready, some sort of some floodplain inundation pieces. Hoping to get one that I'm particularly excited about, fingers crossed, is a kind of a parcel size raster across the whole geography. So not the exact perfect parcel lines, but something that gets you a sense of whether they're big parcels or smaller parcels, but consistent across the entire Southeast. So we'll see how that's going, and we've got a few other things in the works as well. So yeah, lots of cool stuff.
Great, thank you, Rua. So with that, I always like to end on this slide. If you want to get more involved in the blueprint and the types of things that you're hearing about today, I encourage you to join the South Atlantic web community at southatlanticlcc.org. That will get you signed up for our monthly newsletter and a monthly reminder email about this web forum. That's it. We won't blow up your inbox, just those 2 regular emails. Connect with Blueprint staff or other members of your cooperative, so always feel free to reach out to me or Rua, Louise, Amy, Mallory, the staff here in Raleigh. And then, of course, we always encourage you to explore the Conservation Blueprint online at southatlanticlcc.blueprint and southatlanticlcc.org/blueprint, and let us know how it's working for you. We're here to support you in using the blueprint in your decision-making, supporting your grants, that sort of thing. So I'm going to move on to just pausing for questions one more time in case anything else has come up, either in response to Katie or in response to Rua's update. All right, hearing no questions, let's go ahead and end a little early, 10:47. So Katie, thank you again for that wonderful talk, and really appreciate everyone tuning in. We had a great turnout today. Hope to see you again in August. Bye, everybody.